I just got knocked up here. Hold up. Oh my god. What the fuck? Okay. What the fuck did you even do? What did you do?
What's up everybody, my name is Beastfury and welcome to my very belated PvE Carnage and Combat Guide. First off, I want to say that it's been some time since I've been regularly uploading Star Wars stuff and I kind of want to apologize for that. I started going through a little bit of a rough patch with the game about a year ago, lost a lot of the passion that I had for it, and just kind of got massively burnt out. But recently I've been playing with a lot of friends again and it's kind of reinvigorated that appeal for me and made me kind of want to start making videos and stuff for enjoyment and to help out what's left of the community. So I do want to say that most of the terminology that I'm going to be using is going to be directed primarily towards the Empire side. I'm not really well versed in the whole pub side terminology, so you know, kind of do your own conversions how you need to, and with that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's start this off with the pros and the cons of this spec. First of all, the pros. Probably the most important part of the spec is that it brings a much desired armor debuff by way of gore. While other classes do have this armor debuff as well, in group compositions that do not have these classes, or in situations where it's better for these classes to play a different spec than the one that has the armor debuff, you are their last hope. For your own information, the other classes and specs with an armor debuff are going to be Marksman Snipers, AP PTs, Arsenal Mercs, and then both Vengeance and Rage Jugs. So if none of these are in the group, then you're stuck with armor debuff duty. Second is that out of the 3 specs for Marauder, this is going to have the highest sustained AoE DPS. And with that AoE and single target rotation, you're going to be able to start and stop pretty much from anywhere in the rotation. It's really nice and easy to be able to pick it back up anywhere in the rotation. Carnage also comes with good, albeit not quite as great as Fury, single target burst, which is more than enough to meet all of the checks that are in the game. Now for the cons. As many of you know, the spec was gutted pretty bad a few months back in 5.6 due to your boy figuring out how you can abuse the ever-living shit out of the spec with the clipping rotation back in 4.0. That then continued to make its way into 5.0 and made the entire spec massively OP. With that comes our first con. This spec is largely inferior to the other two in terms of sustained single target DPS. While the spec is still alright in terms of short DPS phases, in instances of prolonged DPS uptime, it's going to pale in comparison to Fury and Annihilation. The next con to this spec is that much of the burst is back-ended, which means that there's a fairly large amount of setup time in order to attain the burst that is allotted in this rotation. The last sort of con with this rotation is more of an opinion that may be shared by some, but it can be the fact that there isn't a completely strict rotation when it comes to building up Rage and Fury in between Ferocity windows, which can leave a little bit of wiggle room that some might like, but some people that prefer a set rotation or at least a very good priority system are a little out of luck, as really the only things you have to worry about with a spec is being able to use your Ferocity on cooldown, do whatever is necessary to make sure you have enough Rage for each Ferocity window, and to make sure that you have enough Fury for every other Ferocity window in order to use your Berserk. So, for stats, here's what we're going to be looking at. Obviously with accuracy, we're going to be running 1 accuracy enhancement and 3 accuracy augments to get 765 accuracy rating. For crit, we're going to be looking at 1,974 crit rating. That translates into 5 crit enhancements and 5 crit augments. Now, last thing is alacrity. So, if you don't know, this game uses a rounding system in order to determine how long your GCD is going to be. This means that there are going to be certain thresholds to hit in order for it to actually take effect on your GCD and do something to speed up your rotation and increase your DPS. In order to take your GCD from the standard 1.5 seconds down to 1.4 seconds, the value is somewhere in the 700s. Then, to go from 1.4 seconds to 1.3 seconds, the value is normally 1,866. With Carnage, however, we get a passive 3% alacrity buff due to a Taru form, which allows us to run lower alacrity in favor of that higher crit, i.e. that 1,974 value. So with Carnage, we're actually running 1,414 alacrity, which translates into 4 alacrity enhancements and 5 alacrity augments. Essentially, if you gear up correctly, The only difference for Carnage from the other two specs is that you would replace 2 Alacrity enhancements with 2 Crit Enhancements. Alright, now let's talk utilities. So, I want to do this a little differently than I did for my 4.0 video. Instead of listing each set of utilities to take for each boss, I'm going to give more of a general discussion of utilities, and then give a couple samples of 2 different outliers of what I like to do. So with that, let's bring up this first one. So here we have what I'll call our brooding build. Basically, it doesn't matter where you spend your first 4 utility points, just make sure that you have brooding, and that you spent your 200k credits on field respec in your legacy tab. The point of this is simply to build your 30 stacks of Fury, and then respec out of it in order to take utilities that will better serve you in the actual fight. Brooding is obviously a good utility to take pre-fight because it will allow us to pop Berserk and then still have Frenzy to be used with Bloodthirst, which will allow us to wreak holy hell on our opener. But the utility is absolutely worthless after those stacks are built, so we don't need it anymore. Now, here we have a kind of basic template for our Marauder or Sentinel. In most fights, this is the basic build that I use. Note that there is still 1 utility point to be used, which I'll talk about in a second. So we pretty much always want to take Brazen for the damage reduction. Obviously, the less damage we take, less healing we need, happier our healers are. The Fury building effect is more of an aside kind of thing. The Fury generation is good, but with our rotation we don't necessarily need it. But can still be useful for the possibility of generating additional Fury prior to any kind of downtime that the fight may end up having. Next up is Cloak of Carnage and Cloak of Rage. In terms of DPS, Cloak of Pain is by far our best and most important defensive cooldown. Defensively, we get 25% reduced damage for up to 30 seconds, and it deals damage to the opponent that hit you, all while only being on a 1-minute cooldown, making it extremely powerful. With these 2 utilities, we jack up the offensive capabilities of this cooldown with an extra 15% return damage and increasing our window to proc Cloak of Pain from 6 seconds to 10 seconds. Then, we can also generate extra rage. I'll get into a bit more when we talk about the rotation, but the rule of thumb is that after 4 rage building procs to Cloak of Pain, we can drop an Assault for an extra Massacre. Next is defensive roll. Not much to say here. 30% reduced AoE damage and 3% reduced internal and elemental damage makes every healer happy. Then we want to have super pred. Generally, we don't want to have to spend our stacks on predation so that we can use it to increase our DPS with Berserk. So, we want to take Relentless to make predation a free movement buff that's simply on a 30-second cooldown. Then, we want to buff up predation with Unbound to give us an additional 30% movement speed increase, as well as the ability to break movement impairing effects. Then you'll see that the last utility point is in Thirst for Rage. Now, I know I might catch a little bit of heat for telling y'all to take this utility point because a lot of people believe it's very lackluster utility, but honestly, I feel it is very undervalued. First of all, it is possible to make the opener rotation work for this without this utility, but for the most optimal opener, we actually kind of need the rage from this utility in order to hit everything that we need to. The full stack of rage obviously has its own merit, even though you're really only netting 2 extra rage in the opener to make the rotation flow. But honestly, 1% healing on yourself each time you spend rage may not seem like much, but over time it adds up. When you're in different situations where your healers might be under pressure, such as Bronze's Burn or someone messed something up and the healers are trying to catch up on heals, if you're able to take even just a little bit of pressure off of them and allow them to focus on other people and get them up, then it can honestly be worth it. So if you do the math, there are 11 rage-spending GCDs in the repeatable sections of the rotation, which takes roughly 20 seconds or so to get through, depending on your alacrity. So, yeah, it's spread out, but that's 5% of your health every 10 seconds, which can be just enough to let you survive while the healers are able to get the tank up, or whatever, so that it's not a wipe. The last utility point, you get to choose where it goes based on what's happening throughout the fight. If it's a fight with stuns or knockbacks, you may choose to take Inexorable. If it's a fight with any kind of AoE, Path Carver for the extra sweeping slash damage is the way to go. If it's a fight where we have the opportunity to take extra sustained damage, whether it be from dots or whatever, we can take Cloak of Annihilation so that our favorite cooldown can come back to us even quicker. Or if it's a fight where there's some kind of cleansable debuff and we want to help our healers out a little bit more, we can take Expunging Camouflage. That way we can cleanse ourselves with Force Camo. Now, real quick I want to talk about utilities that seem good, but that I generally try to stay away from with really any kind of build. For the most part, Phantom looks like a good utility, more movement speed both in the fight and on camo, and a longer camo, but in my opinion, if you need to get somewhere fast, we have Super Pred. And that's on a 30-second cooldown compared to the 45-second cooldown of camo. I'm also a pretty big believer that Force Camo should be used primarily to drop your threat, rather than movement speed. And as such, you won't actually need the increased duration of camo because you'll just be hitting it between GCDs, which are going to end up breaking you out of your camo anyway. Bloodboard is another one. So yes, immunity to certain effects and the self-healing on it is great and all, but you have to realize this is on a 3-minute cooldown timer. Depending on how long the fight is, we'll use it, what, twice? Maybe 3 times? Not really worth it. Especially because there really are so few instances of us actually being incapacitated. Hidden Savagery is pretty bad in my opinion. In a dummy par situation, yeah, sure, you'll take it, it's worth it. But in an actual fight, you're going to be much more focused on the mechanics and everything else that's going on, that using camo on cooldown to get the most out of this utility just isn't really going to register. Now, Interloper is nice and all, giving you that extra charge mobility, but in my opinion, if you're going to need this utility, it's primarily because of a lack of understanding of different mechanics of the fight and or not really having much forethought as to what's going to be coming up next involving knockbacks and the like. Lastly is the Undying utility. Sure, 2 seconds extra duration and 30 seconds off the cooldown of one of the most powerful defensive cooldowns in the game seems amazing, but again, like Saber Ward, this is on a very long cooldown overall. And there's so few chances to actually use it in an encounter that, yeah, we don't really need it. That being said, with the very first special build I want to show you guys, we do actually take this utility. So you guys can call me a big-ass liar on that one. So, for Nightmare Terror from Beyond, this is the build that I'll run with. Like I said, call me a liar, but we actually want to take the Undying here because it syncs up really well in phase 2 of the fight, so that we can eat pretty much every single Tentacle Slam the boss gives us for more DPS uptime. As for the second special build that I have for you guys, this is what I'll normally take on Firebrand Stormcaller and Vorgath in Nightmare EC. As you can see, we can utilize the extra 4 rage from defensive system knockbacks, as well as being able to take Sweeping Slash, where, with some proper positioning, we can sweep all the adds underneath the shield, while we keep our backs to the shield so that it doesn't get hit with the sweeps. And then in Vorgath, we want to actually position ourselves in front of the droid so that we're always constantly taking those overloads, but just being knocked back into the wall for those extra 4 rage, and then when adds come in, we just start sweeping away. Alright, so now time for the rotation. So here's what we're looking at for both Carnage and Combat. Understand that there's a little bit of wiggle room surrounding this spec, as not everything needs to necessarily come off in this order. This is just kind of a template to base your rotation off of. You start with the white section, which is your opener, then you move on to green, then blue, then you cycle between the two, going green, then blue, then green, then blue, all the way until your target's dead. So while I let a simple parse run, I want to talk about the general methodology behind this spec, meaning the kind of mindset you have to be in with this, as well as some of the general guidelines to follow. Like I said earlier, the spec has a fair bit of wiggle room, but one major thing with this spec, in order to get the opener to work, is that you will need to take the Thirst for Rage utility. When it comes to your Ferocity windows, you don't necessarily have to use them in the Ravage, Devastating Blast, Gore order I have for the Berserk window, or the Vicious Throw followed by Devastating Blast order that I have in the second window. You can actually perform either window in their own order as you see fit. For instance, if the target is moving away from you during your Berserk Ferocity window, it might be a good idea to finish that window with a Devastating Blast instead of a Gore. The placement of each Massacre is kind of particularly placed due to the Massacre buff you attain each time you use Massacre. So for those of you that don't know, the Massacre buff is a 6-second buff that takes your typical 20% chance at an Interior Form strike up to 50% chance, allowing more Interior Form strikes to theoretically happen when you're not using Massacre. So maintaining this buff for an optimal rotation is an absolute must. The build-up between Ferocity windows can also vary, as the only things that you truly need to worry about are building your Fury stacks and making sure that you have enough Rage for each Ferocity window so that you can use Ferocity on cooldown. As a little note, you should have at least 8 stacks of Fury going into the second Ferocity window where you're going to be using Vicious Throw and Devastating Blast, just to kind of keep it in your mind. Now, you might be asking yourself why Vicious Throw is in the second window instead of replacing Ravage in the first window. Although it is indeed a DPS increase, it actually affects your Fury generation negatively, which will make it so that you have to delay your next Berserk window by 2 GCDs so that you can use an extra Assault and Massacre. Even though Vicious Throw generates Rage for us in this spec with the Slaughter proc, it still counts as a Rage spender in terms of Fury generation. Ravage, on the other hand, is a neutral ability in terms of Rage generation, and it doesn't generate any Fury. Now, as far as any kind of extra damage from Frenzy in this rotation, there's nothing really special to add. When Frenzy comes off cooldown, you may be tempted to pop it so that you can get 2 back-to-back Berserk windows, but the problem with that is you'll be completely thrown off of your Fury generation if you do that, and the rotation as a whole starts to kind of unravel, and then you just have to try to scramble to get it back on track. Usually I'll just save Frenzy as a tool to use if I make a mistake in the rotation or if there's downtime in the fight and I don't have enough Rage to build up a full stack of Fury. I can pop Frenzy, get my 30 stacks so that when the downtime is over, I can jump right back in and basically just restart the rotation from scratch with my opener. During execute phase, or sub 30% of the target, your rotation can be altered a little bit in order to include an extra Vicious Throw per cycle for a slight execute DPS buff. But for this, it's a little finicky, and it's largely going to be dependent on when your Slaughter proc is occurring in the fight. In a typical dummy parse, you're going to proc your Slaughter about 1 or 2 GCDs after your first Vicious Throw in the second Ferocity window. With this, you can replace your Assault in the first block with that Vicious Throw. But you have to understand that this is going to be a much tighter on Rage management due to you only gaining 1 Rage instead of 2. And then your second Ferocity window, you'll be losing 2 Rage instead of gaining 1, because you won't be using a proc Slaughter. In order to supplement this, you can actually use the whole Cloak of Rage build that I talked about. So for the most part, this kind of execute, you're really only going to see in boss fights where you're taking that predictable ticking damage for that Cloak of Rage. Speaking of Cloak of Pain, like I said before, every 4 ticks of damage that you take with Cloak of Pain, you're able to replace an Assault with a Massacre, provided that you have that Cloak of Rage utility, which is obviously going to be a DPS boost. Massacre does a lot more damage than Assault. But you have to be aware of your Rage generation and track it in order to maximize your output. So that's about all I have for the single target rotation, so I'm going to let the rest of this parse run, and then I'll move on to the AoE section. Alright, so for AoE, we've essentially got 2 rotations to talk about. The first one right here is specifically with 2 targets. Now, obviously we want to have Sweeping Slash utility for that extra 25% sweeping damage, and as you can see here, essentially all we do is replace Massacre with Sweeping Slash. Then, on this second rotation right here, it's going to be for 3 or more targets, where basically we just throw all of our Rage Spenders out the window and just spam Sweeping Slash. So notice how there's no Smash included in either of these rotations. I saw a friend streaming one night on his Mara, and he used Smash while playing Carnage, and it pretty near gave me a stroke. So I'm telling you right now, if I see a Carnage Marauder using Smash in their AoE rotation, I'm going to make it my personal goal to find you, walk over to your keyboard, and remove whatever button Smash is bound to. So let me explain to you why we never use Smash in Carnage. If we read the tooltips, you would, at first glance, think that of course Smash does more damage, at least without the Sweeping Slash utility. Once we add the utility, Sweeping Slash actually does even more damage than Smash, but even without the utility, I'm going to explain to you why we still don't use Smash. So, the reason for that is pretty simple. It's the way Smash and Sweeping Slash interact with Ataru Form. Smash registers as one kinetic hit for X amount of damage. Sweeping Slash registers as an energy strike that, even without the Sweeping Slash utility, hits for slightly less than Smash. With the utility, hits for even more. But Sweeping Slash also registers an Ataru Form strike on every enemy that it hits, giving you an extra 2,000 to 3,000 damage per enemy that it hits on top of the damage that it's already dealing. So please, for the love of the Marauder gods and all things Eric Musco, stop using Smash while playing Carnage. You're absolutely destroying your AoE damage. And with that, we're all finished with this edition of the Carnage Marauder Guide. With 6.0 being announced, my hope is to be able to create another updated video with the whole new rotation when it's released, but we'll see. I have some personal stuff coming up this summer and fall that's going to demand a lot more of my attention, but I'll hopefully have the time to work on this. Also, be on the lookout for my Annihilation video, hopefully being released sometime next week or the week after. Until then, happy maraudering.